Hi everyone, I'm Simon Sharwood. I'm the first journalist in Australia who learned to spell IOWN. I'm a Sydney local, so afterwards if you want some tips on where to go snorkelling, where to go swimming, where to ride your bike, I'm happy to give some hints. We've got a slightly reduced panel today.
But he's on his way.
So
he'll be here shortly.
So we'll attempt to be agile. Look, I'm keenly aware that most of you probably have a plan to sneak out in about 20 minutes and take a killer selfie down by the Opera House, but we'll try and make this worth your while before you sneak off and do that. So the place I wanted to start today was to, well, what I'd hoped to do was actually be talking to Giovanni about how he feels forum technologies can impact telecoms here in Australia. And I know you're across that, Jeff. Can you maybe speak to that to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think globally, if you look at kind of the revenue base for telecom providers right now, there's a need to kind of find new revenue spaces, and there's a need to kind of lower the actual cost of operations. And certainly this business-to-business opportunity around data centers, around financial services, around all the different industries that you saw presented create those chances. I think operationally, anytime we can infuse more AI into the customer experience, anytime we can infuse AI more into the actual operations side of things, and then ultimately kind of upsell, cross-sell opportunities, those are all chances. But right now, we're already finding out that these AI opportunities are already outstripping current network technologies. So one research that Accenture did was 87% of the current network technologies of all of these enterprises is already being outstripped with the current AI demands, not the actual future AI demands. So there's quite a bit of opportunity for telecom providers to kind of support that.
And in the Australian context, it's also important because we're so big. I mean, for those of you who don't understand the demographics and geography of Australia, we have about the population of Greater Los Angeles or Greater New York, but in a landmass 2/3 the size of the continental United States. It's dry and empty out there, but we still have a very high standard for our carriers, and I gather one of the things TPG is looking to is sharing infrastructure with its competitors as a means to protect its margins and protect its profits using forum technologies.
Yeah, I think that when you look at every geography is so different, like you had mentioned. I mean, this landmass, there's populations on the coast and density in kind of the Sydney, Melbourne, all the way to the west of Perth, but there's tremendous land opportunity in the middle. So, the data center example, Olivia, that you had mentioned, if there's an opportunity where you don't have to actually have the data center near the population centers, that changes the entire economic equation of this, right? If you don't need to be near power grids, if you need to be near certain power grids that aren't overstressed, if you need sources of water for cooling, and if you need kind of a network to be able to actually connect that, there's a lot of land in Australia. It's actually an advantage to actually have that kind of land mass.
And I know Kawashima-san has spotted something we're doing about 150 kilometres north in the Hunter Valley.
Pardon?
The project to co-locate data centres with generation capacity in the Hunter Valley.
The Hunter Valley?
Yeah, just north of Sydney.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I've checked the Australian data centers map, and also I've learned that there's 5 or 6 renewable energy zones in New South Wales. So we want to connect the industrial sites in Sydney with green data centers in these 5 or 6 renewable energy zones. And that would enable New South Wales people to use GPU computing resources operated with renewable energy. But I think that what we can contribute to this infrastructure with ION Global Forum technology is to address the issue how the benefits with such renewable energy operated AI computing resources evenly distributed to industrial users who are concentrated in Sydney area. And ION APN would be a good network infrastructure to connect such data centers with industrial places located in Sydney. And as you say, APN is infrastructure that enables people to share infrastructure optically. Sharing infrastructure optically means it does not cause any packet data loss or data delay. So that is a very important feature when people share the connectivity to AI computing resources.
And we're in a fascinating situation here in Sydney. There's an industrial city about 150 kilometres north of here called Newcastle. It's one of the world's great coal provinces, and it's also home to coal-powered electricity generation that is slowing down. So there's extraordinary infrastructure there that could perhaps be repurposed for data centres, and Forum Technologies perhaps make it viable to put those data centres close enough to Sydney in terms of latency, even though they're not in town. So, Olivia, does that sort of thing, help to strengthen sovereign capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you've described is actually really similar to strategies that have been pursued by the UK. So in the United Kingdom, there are quite a number of sort of industrial areas or former industrial zones that have fallen by the wayside because of the offshoring of manufacturing. And now the government's seriously looking back at these places and trying to think of ways to revitalise them by creating them as new tech towns, new data centre hubs, or indeed renewable energy zones. So it is very much about creating that, creating a sovereign capability. And again, I often say sovereign with in quotation marks, because every country needs to have its own assessment of what sovereign looks like to them and how it suits their economy and the nature of its supply chains. But I certainly think we're not going to say no to having more homegrown capability, right? I think that's sort of a no regrets investment in many ways, particularly given sort of the geopolitical environment we're currently in. If we look at just the past couple of months and probably more months ahead, every time we have been struck by a supply chain shock, whether it was in the height of COVID or now in the current fuel crisis, we wonder, why don't we have more of that capability within our own borders, or an ability to have redundancies or diversification strategies? And we tend to think about these things a little bit too late.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting when you look at kind of the layers of sovereignty like you described, right? And there's a lot of decisions, I think, Simon, that need to be made at layers of sovereignty, right? There's the full piece of sovereignty, which is, your data, your compute, your network, and you air gap everything. And then there's decisions around what's critical and important that you want to keep sovereign, but the other parts maybe that are not as critical you could think through. So there's still a lot of, like you said, that air quotes of sovereignty is super interesting.
Yeah, and sovereignty is not binary. It's not a 0 or a 1. It's absolutely on a spectrum. It's on a spectrum where there are very clear trade-offs too that we have to be clear-headed about. Some are going to be trade-offs between efficiency, capacity, or semblance of sovereignty, and they all come with costs. And who is going to wear those costs as well? And that's probably a much more of a difficult sort of political conversation about who carries the costs for greater sovereignty.
I know that here in Australia, our Department of Defence is comfortable using a captive, probably air-gapped data centre from Amazon Web Services, despite the fact that the Cloud Act means that AWS could conceivably be compelled to share data with the US. So yeah, it's a tricky balance.
And I think also the big providers are trying to think through opportunities around that to make sure that they fulfill Europe's standards versus Australia's standards. And yes, there's the Cloud Act, but there's control points that I think the big providers are thinking about helping with, right? The authentication and the access management of it, the data sharing, like you mentioned. I think that's all, it's live, it's happening right now, trying to evolve so that they can, still help, because that's where a lot of the investment dollars are, whether we like it or not. There's massive investments in that cloud space from the ecosystem providers, as well as on the AI space from them. So to say full sovereign, as Olivia pointed out, it's super expensive to try and keep up with that investment profile if you're not somehow working with them.
So speaking about the sovereignty, Of course, we should consider sovereignty of computing infrastructure and also the sovereignty of data. And one of the feature of ion technology is that we can allow to consider the sovereignty, computing infrastructure sovereignty and data sovereignty independently. For example, we may choose to keep our data in our private facility while sharing computing resources on the cloud. So this is one of the important feature of that would be required for sovereign AI. So today, people say data center. Even for a facility to deploy computing servers. But I think this is based on the assumption that people are thinking that data and computing resources should be co-located. But in Ion APN, probably we would have computing center and data center. Probably data center would be located closer to customer's environment, but computing center will be somewhere in renewable energy zone. This kind of flexibility will be realized with Ion's technology.
I think that's an incredibly powerful benefit when I consider that so much of enterprise data adoption, AI adoption, is sort of stuck in what's commonly termed proof of concept hell. It's like you know the capability is there, but there is that reluctance if you're talking about processing your enterprise data, that there is that reluctance or that caution about how am I going to do this at scale for my business without losing my data, without having some sort of leakage of my data off my systems. And so that, I think, is sort of one way we can think about disaggregating the sovereign computing layer from sort of a more sovereign data layer, so you preserve that data control even if you're offloading the compute portion of the workload. And I certainly think, thinking back to my time being an AI product manager inside government, in terms of government services, the Australian government and the department I was working for holds some of the most sensitive and unique data sets that we have in this country. And it would have been an incredibly difficult task for us to think about scaling up to the way we needed to for some of those use cases.
Do you think that the governance frameworks are ready for disaggregated data centres and compute centres?
I cannot think of any government policy that would stop us from disaggregating data from computing reason. What kind of? I think I cannot think of any government policy that would stop us.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think part of it is just awareness that now you have a technology and patterns to make this possible, and then what's the ramifications of that that come up, right? I mean, there's implications on all ends of this that if you can separate it, there's kind of a control factor on the actual data side of things, which you need to think about, but then there's a cost structure on the compute side of things that you need to think about. And if they're all air-gapped on shore, is that the most economical way to do things? Or, I think the awareness first, and then what are the implications?
Simon, I think there's one technical challenge, because even if we say that this is we have high bandwidth, low latency connectivity so that we can just send the data to the computing resources and process it. But people would think that, computing infrastructure operator may steal their data. So we may say that trust us, but trust is just a matter of humanity. But what we think is, what we have to achieve is zero trust, meaning that without trust, we can be sure that data will not be stolen. This is what we need for trust. I can trust my neighbors because I know that my house is protected with locks. This is the important feature to have trust. So in Ion Global Forum technology, of course, we can achieve such a system. We can solve the trust issue with security technologies. And this is very important issue that we should solve to disaggregate computing resources and data.
Do you think that the secure multi-tenancy technologies of today are up to the job. I mean, I know AWS uses a network card, a specially designed network card to enforce and increase isolation between workloads on shared infrastructure. Virtualization vendors are all about that. Are they ready for disaggregated facilities?
These are the key technologies, but I think we should ensure that these technologies can work without performance degradation. And for that, typically, the key network transport layer should provide high bandwidth, low latency, zero packet loss data flow. And we can achieve that with ION APN. Without that, probably we have to do some kind of TCP/IP-based data communication, and so on. And then that would result in severe performance degradation.
And do you think data centers are ready for the incredible torrent of information that can be carried over the APN?
Well, yeah, I think data centers would be ready, and people would be concerned. Typically, one of the issues with today's connectivity services, even if this is technically possible, but in many cases, still carriers connection services is very expensive. So it doesn't, for many of users, it doesn't make economical sense. But what we do here is that we try to make such solutions economically justifiable. So we do some kind of techno-economic analysis to calculate the total system cost and total system cost of ownership. And here, when we do such study, one of the important aspects of ION APN is we can make customers pay for optical transceiver. Actually, optical transceiver is the most expensive component in the infrastructure. But with ION APN, we can make customers maybe data center providers or some industrial research organization, they will pay for optical transceiver in order to make AI computing infrastructure. And that would enable the connectivity cost significantly. So I think this is one of the, what I'd like to say is today's challenge is the connectivity cost. But ION APN is a new architecture to resolve this connectivity cost issue.
Okay. We've spoken a little about social license. We're going to be building these big data centers and small data centers in all sorts of different places. And hopefully they take advantage of ION Global Forum technologies. Olivia, I'm just wondering, do you have an inkling into how data centers can earn and keep social license?
It's a great question. Firstly, though, I was told, and I know we have many people in the audience who are from international companies, I was told that social license is an Australianism.
Ah.
Like, is that true? You've never heard of that, Vito?
Ah.
Maybe define it for everybody.
So let's define that first. Shall we do that first?
Yep.
So social license is basically your social compact as a company, as an institution, whatever organization you would be. It's your compact with the public that you are there. You can be there to make money, that's absolutely fine, but that you are there to do no harm and that you are ultimately doing more social good than you are harm, I suppose. That's probably, would that be?
In the Australian context, I imagine many of you are aware that we have now banned social media for children under 16.
Great.
We've done that because we've decided that social media, like cigarettes or alcohol, is a dangerous product.
I see.
And that social media companies have lost their social license.
Because they have prioritised their profits over any other sort, over the social harms that they know they are perpetrating against minors.
Yep.
That is the argument. So that's social license for
I
those
see.
of our international audiences and our fellow panelists.
I understand that.
Now, to your question about how data center operators can build social license, I have to say that I think the Australian industry has been quite proactive in this, in the sense that we now have an industry body that was established, Data Centres Australia, that was started only a little while ago, because they could see this happening overseas in the United States. Like, they're almost like the US experience has been a little bit of a canary in the coal mine for Australian data centre operators in terms of building that social license, in terms of not deciding to build data centres in the most drought-stricken areas of Australia, in terms of entering into power purchase agreements for renewables, and in terms of committing to more green and more renewable sources of energy. There's also been just a high degree of actual, like to their credit, as I mentioned before, they do genuinely perform quite well on their energy and water efficiency ratings. Some of the Australian companies have invested significantly in R&D to make that possible, including proprietary cooling technologies and the like, and closed-loop cooling. So I think credit where credit's due, they have laid a lot of that groundwork. I do wonder if there's also a sense of misinformation, or maybe not misinformation is the right word. Is it mis or disinformation? What's the one that you spread the information because you think it's true, but it's not actually true, but you're not trying to be...
Misinformation.
Is that mis?
Yeah.
Sorry. I always get those confused. Thank you. So there may be a bit of misinformation here because our media landscape is very much dominated by the United States. And I say that as someone working at the United States Study Centre, where it's incredible to me how so many Australians are more engaged in US politics than Australian politics. So they sort
It's fun to watch right now.
I mean, fun? Is that your word for it?
It's entertaining, I think, for other countries to watch.
It's a little bit PTSD for me every time I open up Truth Social. But it does mean that we sort of kind of have a tendency to overlay the American experience onto the Australian environment in a way that isn't entirely warranted. So I do wonder if there's a little bit of that happening, but also we've seen a little bit of this misinformation for renewables writ large, right? Like, there are still people who are suing wind farm operators. There's some really tense grassroots campaigns against wind farms in prime agricultural land in certain parts of Australia. It's been a really interesting evolution about how we talk about renewable energy in this country that is now feeding into, I think, some of the questions around data centres.
Yeah.
But I think there is another aspect of the social licence piece, which is that Australians, multiple surveys have demonstrated this, that Australians continue to be incredibly sceptical about AI, about the productivity benefits of AI. And it's sort of a chicken and egg problem, right? Can you counteract that cynicism by demonstrating the benefits of AI, or do you need to demonstrate the benefits of, do you need to adopt more AI to counter that criticism? Like, it should be a virtuous cycle rather than a corrosive downward spiral.
Okay. I've been told Giovanni from TPG is here and is about to speak. So let's very quickly wrap things up with a quick prediction from each of you. What do you think the ION Global Forum Technologies' biggest impact will have been in 5 years?
Well, yeah, I think the biggest impact is the many nations start building sovereign AI infrastructure.
Okay.
And that sovereign AI infrastructure would be built in a way such that data center operators and AI-related technologies companies maintain social licenses because they contribute to the growth of regional economy.
Okay.
And in this trend, the ION Global Forum's network technologies becomes the essential element of the infrastructure. That would be the biggest impact.
Okay. Jeff?
I think the thesis would be AI is going to happen, but it can be inhibited by the network. So as a result, we have to actually modernize the network and keep up with kind of the AI innovation that's happening. And that becomes the foundation to be able to do much more than just data centers, because that's still at the infrastructure layer. But how do we actually reinvent all the other industries because we've now enabled that? I do think that it's not just Australia that has skepticism on the ROI of AI. I think globally there's a question on, will there be kind of a dip, not a crash, but a dip, until we actually kind of relaunch and find the ROI off of that off your CapEx and OpEx. But I think it becomes, mandatory to update these networks and modernize to something that can keep up with it and future-proof it. And I think it becomes the foundation to actually kind of drive this digital core of cloud, edge, data, AI, security off of this network so you can kind of start to reinvent.
Olivia?
I kind of agree with all of that. I think in 5 years' time, we're going to see those bottlenecks, and we're going to see those bottlenecks in a really big way. And so I would anticipate that the most productive thing that Iron Global Forum can contribute is to demonstrate the art of the possible with a different architecture, with a different way of embedding optical and or networking and photonics into some really critical trends in AI, like synchronous replication of data, like federated learning algorithms, low latency compute on edge devices, VR and AR for really critical sectors like mining, defense sustainment. Sorry, these are just things I wrote down as you two were talking. And also just with higher resolution audio and video and file transfers rather than sort of the text-based transfers that we're used to. We are going to see all of the demand push towards more breakthrough technologies and different ways of doing things.
Cool. Okay, let's give the panelists a big hand for their expertise and their thoughts.